want to ask a series of questions in this fourth episode of the first series. Does the universe need a substance? Does the universe need a creator? A being which stands at the root of the natural order and creates and manufactures a universe? And in the process of manufacturing the universe, does this creator need a substance like a putty? Does our understanding, does it really require us to have those two concepts? And another question is that, is the scientific image of the universe one related to cause and effect without meaning being present? The question of meaning is always complicated by the many interpretations of what meaning is itself. Is it correct to reduce the scientific understanding to simply to meaning? This rich tapestry and complex structures and patterns and formations and behaviors under certain conditions, certain objects and certain entities will interact and behave in certain ways, etc., etc. But the ultimate conditions, remain, if you like, slightly more complex than we tend to realize. But does that scientific image actually necessarily exclude meaning? So there are lots and lots of interrelated questions. The first one is perhaps the question of religion and a literal God. What do I mean by a literal God, and why spend time with it? You might say, well, why not simply declare you're an atheist, you don't believe in a God, and be done with it? I think actually taking that response is grotesquely unfair and simplistic. It's very easy to dismiss something which millions and trillions of human beings have considered sacred in their lives, and simply to dismiss it and say that, they had no idea what they were talking about, and they're all confused, and religion is more to do with biological necessity and all kinds of other formations, and give it some rationalization. But what happens if the instinct for God and the instinct for this deeper metaphysics is something we come back a lot to in these discussions, is built into our very nature, right at the root level? That perhaps if we understand ourselves as part of the natural order, and there is no being, no simple anthropomorphic or literal entity we can call God and attach our thinking to God, even within religious circles, that oversimplifies, that literalizes and flattens out the complexity that religion, perhaps in its real inner working, is trying to make you understand. That really the mystery of the cosmos and the link and the relationship for a human being, the natural world, and our actions to a whole cosmic formation, a religion plays an attempt to give you a big picture. Is it always just about mythology? Is it always just about reducing to a single being and then arguing and saying this is the literal truth? Or is there perhaps a richer way, and that does not allow us to very simplistically just dismiss religion, but it may make us quite happily and sensibly dismiss the literalization of our religious worldviews? So that on one side, we have the notion that a cosmos needs a creator. Not all human beings have felt this. If you look at non-Christian positions and non-Abrahamic positions, there is a God doesn't operate as an entity, as a being, and even if that's a distortion of the original conception, it still lends itself to this, a God, a being, the William Blake God leaning down, etc., long white beard, etc., etc. That literalization hasn't been shared by all human beings. That's the first thing to say. And even within the fabric of any religion, it isn't consistently held by everyone who claims to be religious. So the anthropomorphic, literal being, entity, God, I think is something which is a symptom of a particular time and place, but not a reflection of the inner essence of the religious impulse. The religious impulse I might define as the desire to understand our connectedness to not just human beings and the planet, but to the whole cosmos, and have some image or some picture which helps us make sense of the world. It doesn't literally have to be true, but equally so, if it's incompatible with our reasoning process, if it's incompatible with our attempt to develop methods of understanding the structure of the middle levels of our reality, then there is a problem with it. So that was one of the issues I wanted to talk about. How necessary is it to bring meaning in your life, to have a literal being? Now, the reason I'm talking in this way is that the flip side of what I'm saying is it possible to conceive of the notion of divinity or a god, but not as an entity, as perhaps the alpha and omega of a mystery, the beginning point and the end point, the question that always arises after death, where do we go, what happens, and the question that always arises prior to our birth, where do we come from? But that links us to the question of meaning. And the question of meaning is perhaps the most vexed question of our age. And perhaps this is why we have so many conflicting, absolute frameworks. Because it feels to some people, and perhaps to many people, that without a coherent framework which helps explain and link together the universe and the human world and the planet we live on in some coherent idea, then the universe is perhaps just a chaos, purposeless, meaningless, and that leads to quite some destructive consequences in our understanding of the universe. And the other question I suppose I do want to also bring into here is the question of substance. Atomism, perhaps the most successful Greek idea when it comes to talking about what is the world made of, the notion of an atom, even though the Greek conception was simplistic, the modern scientific conception of an atom is much more complex. In fact, the modern conception allows for structure and complexity and form. It doesn't simply reduce an atom to a substance. The notion of a substance in many ways in modern science has disappeared under the notion of a complex structure under conditions. And conditions in which structures are formed, and the conditions those structural formations themselves then create. Water is a very good example. Any simple understanding of the way that water is itself an extraordinary structure, without which it would be impossible, I suppose, for us to see how our form of life or certain forms of life would have occurred. There is something quite extraordinary, and we lose that sense of what's extraordinary when we reduce science simply to an explanation of mechanics, machinery, and so we see the cosmos as essentially a complex, rule-governed machine. Okay, it's more complex than, say, the simplistic 18th century versions of it, but even the modern computational models of complex algorithms is still machine-like. It has no real intelligence, and intelligence is just, if you like, an appearance. What in traditional philosophers used to say is an appearance and has no real reality. It's an illusion, effectively. And there are contemporary thinkers and philosophers who quite legitimately make that point. The problem is that is that a correct interpretation of what science says? B, what happens to meaning and how meaning operates in our life? Because if we leave it at that stage, it might satisfy a handful of people who live in the rarefied environments of universities and write that type of material, but for the vast majority of people, it won't, other than in a very destructive, corrosive way, be seen as anything more than just a way of eroding a belief. So perhaps where we ought to focus ourselves is this notion of a belief and these kind of beliefs. Let's say that a belief is a conviction in the intelligibility of the universe. And so when we look at religion, we look at science, both of whom present you with a belief in the intelligibility of the world. Science does it, religion does it. This sense, the intelligibility, the ability for us to feel, but do we know this? That's another question. But for us to feel that the universe makes sense, it has an order, and the concept of order comes with a sense of it being decipherable, comprehensible, made intelligible, graspable. Whichever model or framework you sit in, that seems to be a really fundamental point. My question is here, is that what fundamentally is involved in the process of making sense of something? And when we talk about things making sense, we do enter a territory where we need to also talk about language and the way that we talk and how we make sense of what someone says. A very simple example would be if you go on holiday and you encounter someone speaking in a language you have no knowledge of, it sounds like simply sounds, patterned sounds. You can tell from situations that there's meaning going on, but you can't know what they're saying. So what is the difference, if you like, when we ask that type of question between being outside a language and inside a language? And I mean that purely in the sense that when you're inside a language and someone speaks, you don't find yourself having to decipher it. You know what it means. Well, that's a contentious statement. There's a sense to what is being said. Whether you know what something means is another question. If someone walks into the room and says something to you, you can say, yes, I know the literal content of what you're saying, but the meaning is involved with context and situations, and so you may not know what they mean, but you can certainly make sense of what they mean. So we come to this question of meaning and making sense. It's interesting because we're on the threshold in many ways of Plato. For me, significantly, Plato's importance for philosophy and for human civilization was a very oversimplified distinction. And the distinction I don't think necessarily holds, but the concepts in the distinction are really, really important. He talked about two worlds. Well, perhaps he didn't talk about two worlds, but we're told he talked about two worlds. People like Nietzsche talk about Plato as if he had two worlds. A real world, a world of eternal forms and patterns, close to mathematics, and this world, which is a poor shadow or a copy of that world. That isn't necessarily an accurate interpretation of what Plato meant. I'm not necessarily here going to argue that Plato had a deeper secret doctrine as such, but what I'm going to argue is that Plato was working an idea through, in my view. And that idea, at the heart of his idea, is how does the world make sense? We have a world of everyday experience. I can see objects, plants, people moving. I get involved, I eat, I breathe, I drink, I'm busy with processes, day-to-day processes, and all the rest of it. This world, this everyday world, which he called, or it's often referred to as the world of the senses, strictly that's too narrow, because we don't really isolate our senses. We always involve our thoughts, imaginings, feelings, and so on. And so that very narrow idea that this everyday world is a world of senses and sensory experience is misleading. And subsequent philosophers and thinkers have really pointed that out. So it's not that Plato necessarily believed that was the case, but in certain formulations it's definitely implied. We have a world of patterns and forms, which leads to, in my view, a middle realm, the realm which frames our everyday world, the world of the natural order, the planetary order, our social order, the objects in our world, and our own feelings, and human beings also. This middle order is the order which is thick with detail and it's concrete. There is no necessarily an abstract pen, but we're surrounded by pens. We can abstract in our day-to-day interactions different categories and so on, in order to bring some order and clarity to this middle order, as I call it, this middle level of our reality. But it's there, and it's rich, but it's not self-standing. It doesn't exist on its own. The planet and the cosmos does not simply just float in a void. That's a conception. And the reason I would argue that's unwarranted to say that is a complete and adequate explanation, is it posits and suggests that things can exist without any meaning. So the real question is, if I'm to talk about things existing without meaning, then surely I need to talk about what meaning is. What am I talking about? What idea of meaning do I have in mind when I say existence encodes meaning? Things that exist don't simply exist as objects and patterns and interacting atomic particles and all this type of stuff. It actually encodes meaning. So what is meaning? Well, let's take two parallel vocabularies to see if we can draw this out. The first vocabulary is often associated with science. For science, to understand something, we have to see, let's say that the object we're interested in is a particular type of malleable rock. We don't know much about it, but we notice it. We want to try to work out its structure, what was traditionally called its properties, but I no longer accept that we're dealing with substances and properties. We're dealing with complex structures which have an internal complex structure which contributes our understanding of how they behave in situations. Strange concept, but think about an atom, a human cell, a human being, and even a society, all following the same pattern. Their interface with the rest of the world, in which the context environment in which they find themselves, is a direct relationship to complex internal processes and structures of that particular thing. So when I talk about an atom in the modern sense, I'm looking at the internal atomic structure as a way of understanding its interface to other atoms and the conditions in which it finds itself. So if you look at the periodic table, a very simple example, it isn't simply a list of properties. It's a description of an internal set of internal structures and variations for this thing called an atom or an element. If we think of a cell, individual single cell, the behavior of that cell under a set of environments and conditions it finds itself in is a function of its internal processes and structures. It isn't simply a substance which has glued to it a certain property. The way that it behaves in its environment is a function of its internal structure. If we think about a society or a group of people who define themselves in a certain unified way, shall we say, the behavior of that group or society is a function of its internal interactions. The formations it has of its own image of identity to that society and that structure, and the way that each individual member responds to. So when one society encounters another, its nature of its encounter is a function of its internal processes and structures. Now that pattern repeats itself endlessly, like a fractal pattern across the whole cosmos. There is no such thing and no need to keep on positing substances. When we look at anything, if it's a block of wood and we want to understand its properties, saying it is a substance and that substance is made from some essence is completely and utterly misleading and oversimplistic. That there is no such thing as a substance. A concept of a substance in the history of our thought was the concept of a simplification or a simpler starting point. It does in some way go back to the pre-Socratic Greeks, but perhaps not only to them. It does go back to the idea that there is some primal stuff, some primal substance, which under different conditions and combinations and permutations generates what we consider to be the world. Of course, you can see how easily that draws in the concept of a creator based on an analogy with the way that human beings alter the world around them to make things. But there is no creator. And the question then becomes, well, have you not just banished God? Have you not just simply declared atheism? My answer to you is no, I haven't, because that would collapse all of religious impulse and all of mythological thought simply back to one image of it, the fundamentalist or literal reading of it. What religion presents you with is the sense that there is a profound inward meaning to the natural order. Nature doesn't simply just exist. Creatures don't simply evolve from one to another. There is no guiding hand in the way that traditional theological views, there's no evidence that there is a guiding hand. And if there is a guiding hand, then, well, we won't get lost in that rabbit hole. The reason I say there is no guiding hand is one of the premises upon which the need to explain the world in theological terms is the concept of a substance. It does trace back, in my view, to Aristotle and Aristotle's huge influence on the development of the church and the church's conception of reality in the cosmos. One crucial element of Aristotle's picture was that there was a substance, what he called matter, and that matter was like a clay. And you can read this in religious texts that come out of that tradition, and that would include Christianity and Islam and possibly Judaism. But Judaism may itself set out a parallel and show traces of a parallel conception, as well as having a notion of a substance which is molded. But the idea of there being a substance or matter which is like a clay that simply exists raises several questions. Does God exist? Does God create matter? Yes, in some conceptions for God to be omnipotent, omniscient, etc., that's the conception. But then that then belies the fact that, well, if you have an omniscient being at the root of existence and nature, why do you need a substance it creates to mold creatures? That's an analogy which is too simplistic, and it's based too heavily on human manufacture. So once you abandon that and say, let's find another way of thinking about this, let's look back to nature and ask, is there a better analogy that we can work with? One that reflects the way that we experience nature. This flux, but it's not a pure chaotic flux, the natural order. It is a very complex, structured flux. It's neither a pure static order and nor is it a pure chaotic, bubbling, seething chaos and ready for everything to melt. Our everyday experience shows an incredible richness of pattern. Otherwise we wouldn't have science. What would science talk about? As well as an incredible richness of movement and flow. So my question is, when we look back, and we do come back to Plato again, when we look at Plato and we think about what Plato Um, Plato is often presented in this way. His two favourite pre-Socratic thinkers were Parmenides and Heraclitus. Heraclitus was the pre-Socratic who defined everything as a fire, but actually even that is a simplification. When he described everything as a fire, his metaphor, his analogy that fire presents us with a better image of the nature of reality, actually has a lot of merit to it. It is essentially a process view. A fire cannot sustain itself, if you take the analogy, without consuming its environment. And in that process, it generates smoke and waste, but it also generates the condition to maintain itself. So this idea of a fire is one aspect, or chaos or flux, shall we say, and the other is the Parmenides idea that being is for something to be, and this is almost a logical statement, for something to be, that would suggest that it cannot not be, and it can never be anything other than to remain being. Now, it seems to me that's a very muddled way of talking about Parmenides, but perhaps an easier way is to see Parmenides' notion of almost a binary. Being simply is. But if being simply is, it never changes, it never undergoes, it cannot not be. And so Parmenides got caught up, and it strikes me that the pre-Socratic philosophers, in their profundity, also reflect the limitation of their own reflexive history. It's a huge advantage to look at the history of our reflections in our arts, in our philosophies and religions in order to think this through. In the time of Parmenides, it's perhaps inaccurate to say this, but I'm often struck by the fact that the separation of what is a subjective or a logical, perhaps would be better, conception, and a conception of the nature of the world, perhaps it would be more helpful if we separated the two out and saw what Parmenides doing is collapsing the two. When he was talking about being, he was talking about the nature, almost a logical statement that for something to be, it cannot not be. Being simply is. This is quite convoluted. I suppose my point here is that if you take Parmenides' idea that if existence does not exist, which is a nonsense statement, it is non-being, then we can't talk about it, because in a sense we're talking about something which isn't even there. How do we know what we're talking about? Even when I say that, I feel that I'm completely and utterly muddled in this whole way of thinking. So let's go to Plato and ask again, what was he? Heraclitus is easier. Heraclitus for me is a process thinker. Parmenides is almost the beginning of logic, the ability of us to logically think through questions about the nature of existence. The profundity of it is this question of how far our thinking based on logic can draw us an image of reality. Well, clearly, if Parmenides genuinely denied change and said it was unreal and illusory, that sounds like nonsense. But I don't believe that actually does him full justice. My instinct is to say, and this is why I think Plato drew on him, is that there is almost a skeletal structure to our cosmos which remains constant, not permanent, not fixed, but constant. And that skeletal structure is the thing that Parmenides was talking about. You or I might grow old. For example, the classic example of, am I the same person? If I grow old, my cells are changing, I'm breathing in the air, they're transforming, and their matter is flowing in and flowing out. In many ways, that does raise a very interesting philosophical question, but perhaps the one that we need to focus on and think about is the one related to there is a skeletal structure. And the only way of capturing this skeletal structure is through the use of logic and symbols. Now we come very close to the third influence in Plato's life, intellectual life, if you like, Pythagoras, and the notion of mathematics and what mathematics means. So my claim here is that the importance of Plato was, in many ways, his ability to draw together seemingly incompatible thinkers to build a much more sophisticated idea of how reality is organized. So for Plato, even though he was more sophisticated, he grouped Heraclitus as the surface phenomena, change, superficial, shadowy, Parmenides reflecting this skeletal constant, not permanent, constant. It has to be in order for this change world to occur. The world somehow, the world of change and everyday sensory information is somehow reflects, participates, or encodes through flux and through matter and change, this skeletal constant. The issue I have is that almost 2,000 years after Plato's original conception, and this is why Whitehead perhaps said everything we write in philosophy is a footnote to Plato, is that essentially my own ideas take the same ingredients but rearrange them in a way that perhaps other people have done as well. So let's work this idea through. The first one is we dispense with an idea of a creator God, but we don't dispense with the idea of God or divinity, which exists at the root of nature. So nature itself is suffused with divinity and a sacred value. But then if we're also to say that, then we also say that nature and the world around us encodes meaning. Everything that exists encodes meaning. That suggests two things. One is that the sense of the world is built into the fabric of the way that the world unfolds. Now, someone might turn around and say, well, what's the meaning of a chemical reaction? Now, the problem with that question is that it suggests that meaning is some kind of glow or some kind of addition or some kind of color to a black and white picture. What happens if meaning is essentially a pattern? And that pattern is the relationship of a sign to the thing that it is a sign of. Now, even saying that, perhaps we're oversimplifying it. So we'll just sidestep into Jacob Boehme, who perhaps might provide us with a couple of interesting and important sidesteps. We think about Jacob Boehme and Jalaluddin Rumi, both of them in a very similar light. Both thinkers essentially could see the cosmos as encoding a signature or a series of signs of what they called God. But their image of a God wasn't a given being. It wasn't that there is a God writing little messages, popping them out in little letters. Those letters are then by some angels or elves, take the Santa image if you like, putting them inside clay, matter, and that matter then breathing life into it and off these creatures go. That's not the image, but that is a very popular image, ironically, of how the universe is made, that there is a little spark of divinity in everything. My question is that contains a seed of a truth and makes only partial sense, but not in the literal sense. What happens if right at the root of nature there is a mystery, that the root itself is mysterious, not just to us, but to itself? Whether it's infinite, whether it knows everything, etc., makes no sense to talk about. In itself, it is a mystery. To understand itself, it needs a mirror. And the cosmos provides that mirror. But the cosmos is not a fixed thing. The cosmos is in flux, it's changing. It has patterns, formations, structures, a skeletal set of constants, if you like, and flux happens within those skeletal structures. But the question is, what meaning does it seek? What meaning does this mysterious root seek? And how does it go about? How does the cosmos go about emerging from this mystery? And why should it? Why should a cosmos exist at all? Now we come to perhaps a really, really important idea, which I would put in kind of crude terms like this. If nature is itself creative, but the point of the cosmos is to discover what it is, then I have an understanding of the meaning of life. It's a paradoxical thing to say, and perhaps it might not make sense, and I suspect it won't, because it'll echo and shadow tons and tons of our traditions, and the danger here is that it will simply sidestep into being another theological variant or an atheistic variant, but it's neither atheistic or theistic. It's going to a question beyond that. It's not positing a source and saying the whole of existence has meaning because of that source. It is saying that if we talk about a source, we cannot talk about this source in the sense that it knows everything and the universe just works out a plan. What happens if the universe itself is a response to a question? The desire to know itself creates a cut within the root itself, and that cut generates and creates a particular cosmos. But in that process of cutting its infinite unknowability, unknowableness, shall we say, for the root, it also leaves a residue. So no cosmos is final or fixed. But every cosmos somehow contributes and explores that question. Every creature that exists somehow contributes towards the answering of that question. There is no final answer, because in order for the universe to exist, it has to cut the unknown. In order for a universe to exist that we know and make sense in knowing terms, we always have a residue of stuff that is unknown. No system of knowledge, therefore, becomes an ultimate explanatory system. When we look at the Christian cosmos or the Buddhist cosmos, we're looking at an attempt to fit elements together and make sense of the whole. Now, they each provide very different perspectives than the one I'm putting here. The one I'm putting here links us as individual human beings to the purpose of the whole cosmos, but it doesn't link us in the sense that we have a predefined plan and a role. That would be perhaps a little bit too simplistic. It links us through this notion that the universe grows out of its root. But it doesn't grow out just in a purely mechanical, machine-like, algorithmic way. It grows with a purpose, and the purpose is to understand itself. Just by analogy, for me to understand myself in my day-to-day interactions, I have to do things. I have to interact with people, and then I discover what I am. If we want to understand the human species, for example, you have to see them in their actions, because each action is a response to a situation, and that response to the situation unfolds what a meaning is. So there are two languages here, very, very close together. The language of conditions. Under conditions, certain things and events occur. We use that language a lot in science, and then in human life, we use that language of responding to situations and contexts. Both are very, very closely related to the idea that the meaning of an action or a behavior is a response to a context. And therein lies the trick. The ultimate context of the cosmos is a mirror which reflects back this notion of not knowing what I am. And through the reflection in the context, i.e. a cosmos, discovering what I am. Now, what if that is the truth? That all these systems of religion, philosophy, science are simply different ways of formulating an understanding of this cosmos, none of which can, by definition, be ultimate. There is always a residue, always a leftover, always something never talked about and never able to be presented in a particular cosmic formation. And you can treat that question also in terms of the way life is formed. We have carbon-based life here, perhaps across this cosmos, maybe not in this iteration, but maybe in future iterations. We will have other forms of life built out of other basis on different types of basis. So we have a different, and hopefully something which opens up some very, very interesting implications for how we live and how we connect to each other. We cannot do without science, but equally so, we cannot do without metaphysics. And this idea that deep down within us is a desire for understanding and knowledge. And if we cancel that desire out, it gets displaced, distorts the nature of our own existence, and turns us into floating fragments in a cosmos. So if you think about Albert Camus' Outsider, for example, you imagine a person who has severed themselves from a universe which is indifferent to them, plays no part in their inner life, and so they negotiate their own meaning and formation of their meaning purely subjectively. But there is almost a diabolic freedom, a destructive freedom in it. It's interesting that this writing was also post-war, because if you look at the formation of totalitarian political systems, which try to fit everything together in a total system, the failure and inevitable failure of that system is that no system of knowledge, because no cosmos, can ever be final or complete. And it's particularly true for human beings. Human beings might not like uncertainty and not knowing, but it's deeply, deeply dishonest to deny the things you do not know and try to cover them over and pretend and lie, because if you like, that is one of the critical elements of where lying comes from, the inability to face the unknown. And it's in confronting these questions in our own life on a day-to-day basis, the uncertainties, the difficulties, that we come to understand a deeper connection to the world. But if that's true, why are people not feeling that way? Why are people feeling more anxious, more worried, and this thing we call mental health issues and mental health? And I say the thing we call mental health, not because I'm denying it has any truth, but simply because there is a huge growth of difficulty, struggle. So we'll stop there and come back to this in a further episode